I'm Sophia, 30, and the first thing I did on my birthday was check my phone, because of course I did. And there it was, a Venmo request from my brother Evan for a grazing table for his baby shower. The request was polite, a string of emojis and a dollar amount like it was some small favor, not the latest in a long list of installments on my life. That little notification felt like a hot pinprick. It wasn't the money alone. It was the quiet assumption that I would pay, like a subscription that renews without asking. I stared at the name Evan plus Maya and the memo, grazing table for baby shower. Split. The split implied. The request implied I'd already agreed to underwrite the party. I was sitting at a table with cake and a single candle and felt nothing but this strange cold math. Me equals bank. The next hour unfolded like a rewind. I thought about every family emergency fund meeting where my parents Helen and Robert murmured about shared responsibility while I signed checks. I thought about the lake house, our family place, as they called it, whose mortgage and renovations I'd quietly fronted for years because I believed in family, in shared memories, in the voice that told me my help was love. I remembered wiring money to fix the septic tank last summer, the new dock boards, the weekend when the roof leaked, and I covered the contractor who forgot to bill everyone else. I remembered being the one who paid for the septic inspection that everyone swore they'd split, then waited a week and finally just paid it, because it was easier than arguing on a Sunday afternoon. It hit me on the ride home from dinner that this wasn't a pattern of small oversights. This was an entire economy built on my tolerance. When I was a kid, I'd been the peacemaker. As an adult, I'd become the family's line of credit. My name was the account number they used when things got inconvenient. They called it our emergency fund, as if emergencies had nothing to do with boundaries and everything to do with me. I don't keep receipts for my feelings, but I do keep bank statements. They're neat, clinical proof. Over the years, I'd moved money into what they called the house, into maintenance, into loans they promised to repay. I've been told I'm generous. I've been told I can't be trusted with money, only in the way people mistakenly tell themselves the truth to sleep at night. What I hadn't been told until a Venmo ping on my birthday was that being generous had become invisible labor, my constant default setting. On my 30th birthday, surrounded by people singing too loudly and a frosting smear on the side of my cheek, I realized the ledger in my life had been closed without my consent. The gratitude I'd been paid for years, thank you texts, broken promises, social media shoutouts, wasn't gratitude at all. It was entitlement, wearing a nicer outfit. So the stakes suddenly felt both enormous and painfully small. Enormous because money is safety and autonomy and the quiet ability to choose who you are for, and small because I was facing the awful truth that a grazing table request could be the thing that finally taught me how little I mattered to the people who said I did. If nothing changed, I would keep being the family's default resource until there was nothing left of me but a balance sheet and a forwarding address. That night, I didn't blow out my candle with a wish. I blew it out like closing a chapter. No apology, no encore. The flame went out and I sat with the sound of silence that wasn't empty so much as newly understood. I woke up the next morning with the same slow, private hum in my chest that people call resolve. The Venmo ping had been a splinter. This was the splinter getting pulled out. I pictured the ledger lines again. The emails, the unpaid IOUs, the roof I'd fixed, the dock I'd paid for, the septic inspection that never split the way they said it would. All of it added up to a number that had more weight than birthday cake candles. $67,000. That was my line in the sand. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't send a manifesto or compose a long, cathartic group text. I moved like someone finishing a puzzle she'd been solving quietly for years. That money was mine. My contributions, my name on the accounts, my unpaid overtime for family comfort. I transferred the $67,000 from my share of the so-called joint emergency fund into my personal account. I didn't narrate it. I archived it. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock. I'd been too polite to notice. There was more to do than paper and digital tidy work. The lake house, our sentimental hub, that warm wood set piece of family summers, was the main stage where my generosity had been performed and taken for granted. I helped build the narrative of family togetherness. They'd always been content to walk on the set while I quietly covered the bills. It felt obscene to let that continue. I had control access. As the one who'd paid for so much of the upkeep, I'd been granted administrative permissions. Formalities I accepted because I trusted them, because trust felt easier than confrontation. That morning, with my transfer complete and my hands steady, I exercised that access. I changed the permissions. I switched accounts. I revoked keys. I didn't want to terrorize anyone, but I wanted them to feel the practical shape of what their entitlement had been. The baby shower day came with the kind of bright, over-enthusiastic planning that made my skin itch. Pastel balloons, a playlist, a grazing table that would have been my birthday's polite echo. I watched from a distance as Evan and Maya set up folding tables and tested tiny cupcakes, unaware they were arranging props on a stage I'd just dimmed. When the guests started to arrive, the house greeted them with the sound of modern embarrassment. The alarm, which had been set to a harmless chime, trilled into an ugly, insistent wail, enough to cut conversations, to ripple through floral arrangements and centerpieces. The thermostat, which they'd left blasting like a small summer in a box, hiccuped and fell silent. The AC that had promised cool comfort folded like a paper fan. Doors that once opened with a practiced twist now offered polite refusal. People fumbled with phone apps and key fobs and the polite small talk that pretends everything is fine. I didn't gloat. I walked into the garden where a friend had stuck a candle into a cupcake and was trying to pretend the situation was quaint. I watched Evan's face when he realized the house wasn't cooperating. Not the smug, triumphant face I'd imagined, but the startled, slightly humiliated confusion of a child whose crutch had been pulled away. Maya's cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with the first real difficulty of having to ask for help she'd assumed would arrive without effort. They called, of course. Tears, accusal, and the inevitable public script of victimhood ready for any sympathetic ear. Logistics. Timing. How inconvenient it all was. I let the calls go to voicemail. I answered none of them. I sat with a coffee in the car and let the garden noise drip through the open window like a moral bell. I knew what I'd done might look petty in a highlight reel, and I also knew why it felt enormous to me. For years, I'd been their emergency. The roof that didn't leak because I sent money, the dock that didn't rot because I arranged the contractor, the mortgage that didn't spiral because I paid the arrears. I had been the human equivalent of a subscription service. Autopay turned into default identity. Removing my card didn't feel petty. It felt inevitable. When someone finally came out, Helen, my mother, she found me sitting on the back steps holding the empty sleeve of a champagne bottle like a stub of my patience. She started with disbelief, moved into accusation, and then tried pity. I told her, calmly, that the account had been reconciled. I told her that the permissions were changed. I told her I wasn't the emergency fund anymore. That night, the house hummed again, but in a different way. The alarms eventually quieted. The cake stayed uneaten in a cooling box. People went home recalibrating their storylines. The baby shower would be postponed, the grazing table rescheduled, the social damage filed under unfortunate. For me, the ledger was uncluttered. $67,000 in my own account and a living room full of the same people who had treated my balance as their baseline. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. The sensation was closer to the iodine smell after a wound is cleaned, stinging at first, and then an odd, clean relief. I'd pulled the plug on a subscription service nobody had asked me to sign up for, and in the disconnection, I began to hear the outline of a life that might be mine alone. There was fallout to come, of course, but the first decisive thing had happened. I'd stopped paying for other people's assumptions. The rest, whether recrimination or relief, would be history. After the baby shower imploded and the voicemails stacked up like unpaid bills, the chorus of outrage was immediate and performative. Maya posted a string of stories with tearful clips and awkwardly framed videos of guests trying to salvage cupcakes. And before long, my inbox filled with messages from cousins and acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years. How could you? Read one text from an aunt I'd only seen at graduation parties. That's so cruel. Scrolled a sympathy DM from a neighbor. Evan called twice, then texted more. First pleading, then accusing, then flinging around the word betrayal, like a banner he hoped would distract from the math. My parents showed up in person, breathless with theatrical disappointment. Helen's voice thickened into a pity I knew how to read, that thin public sorrow that disguises the question, why did you make us look bad? Robert tried logic, numbers and timelines, until his eyes slid away from me and he landed on the perfectly delivered line. You always do too much. They all wanted an explanation that erased responsibility. They wanted the ledger to return to its old borders, where my name sat at the bottom, smoothing over the lines. That was the moment the family roles became crystal clear. I was the scapegoat, expected to absorb shame, inconvenience, and cost, while Evan was, unmistakably, the golden child. He could stumble into spectacle and be washed clean by the tide of family stories that favored charisma over accountability. The public victimhood routine only confirmed what I'd already suspected privately. I had been fueling a system that didn't want me to understand the scale of what I'd been doing. Their reaction was the proof I didn't need, but now had. Entitlement doesn't apologize. It manufactures offense. Once the initial drama settled into a predictable cycle of group texts and side conversations, I stopped reacting and started doing the only practical thing left. Emotions are a currency, but so is evidence, and I wanted mine counted and validated by people who wouldn't take anyone's performative grief at face value. I hired a forensic accountant, her name was Dana, and a real estate attorney, Marcus, both recommended by a friend who didn't sugarcoat things. Dana was precise in a way that felt like comfort. She spoke in timelines and traceable transactions. Marcus, the attorney, smelled faintly of old books and quiet competence. I signed retainer agreements with my hands steady. For the first time in years, I felt the small, insane thrill of hiring people whose job was to translate my life into incontestable facts. Dana pulled every digital thread. She subpoenaed bank statements, pulled transaction histories, cross-referenced vendor invoices for the lake house, and mapped the ledger as if it were a crime scene. Marcus explained the mechanics of property law like someone describing a chessboard. Titles, liens, powers of attorney, and the brittle places where fraud can hide. They both asked me questions I should have asked myself years ago. When did you stop asking for receipts? Who signed what? Where did the loans actually go? And I answered them with the blunt clarity that comes from having stopped pretending you don't already know the truth. Meanwhile, the house, our sentimental anchor, became the legal problem it always had been. Marcus advised that if discrepancies showed a misuse of funds or improper encumbrances, selling the lake house might be the cleanest, fastest way to sever the financial tethers that bound me to a family economy I no longer wished to underwrite. The decision felt devastating and liberating in the same breath. Selling a home isn't just a transaction. It's the dissolution of a shared mythology. But the myth had been bought with my quiet labor and my bank account. It wasn't mine to carry anymore. Friends leaned in, some with questions, most with practical help. Recommendations, consolations, and unexpectedly, casseroles. The family continued to rehearse their grievances in public forums and private calls, but I'd moved the conversation into a courtroom of numbers and legal counsel. That was where narratives met receipts, and for the first time, I liked my odds. Dana called it a breadcrumb trail. Marcus called it paper and law. I called it proof. When Dana handed me the thick folder, a forensic report with redacted bank statements, invoices, and a printed title report that looked like a judge's script, I felt like someone had slid a verdict across the table. There it was, a $100,000 loan recorded against the lake house, a lien that hadn't been there when I'd last checked, and a power of attorney document that purported to bear my signature authorizing Evan to act on my behalf. I knew, almost before I read it, that I hadn't signed that paper. I knew because the handwriting on the document was the kind of confident squiggle I never make. It didn't curve the way my hand does when I try to hurry through a signature. Dana had already run it through a forensic document examiner. The analyst's note was clinical and brutal. Signatures on file are inconsistent with subject samples, pressure patterns, and stroke order do not match. Marcus had subpoenaed the bank and the title company. Their records showed the loan was closed 2 months after I'd wired money for the dock boards. Money that, in the bank's ledger, had been used to pay off a contractor I'd already paid. I sat with the papers like a juror listening to a closing argument. The more I read, the less I had the option of disbelief. The power of attorney had been notarized. The notary's statement was on file. But the notary's appointment log showed they had no record of me ever being in their office that day. The metadata on the scanned document showed it was uploaded from an IP address registered to Evan's phone provider. It wasn't dramatic forensics in a movie. It was practical, telltale, and precise. When I asked Marcus what my options were, he leaned back and used words that felt like tools. Rescission, lien release, criminal referral, confession of judgment. He explained that selling the lake house could clear the lien and any outstanding debt tied to it, practical containment, then final severance. He also explained that if Evan had forged my signature, that was not only civil fraud, but criminal forgery. There was a quiet moment where the air between us measured itself with consequences. I chose confrontation on my terms. I called the meeting at my parents' kitchen table, the same table where so many family financial planning conversations had happened. And I invited them all. Helen, Robert, Evan, Maya. They arrived with the expectation that I'd cry and then wire money. They left with something else. I laid the documents down in the middle of the table like cards in a game I was tired of losing. I didn't rise to their theatrics. I showed them the title report with the recent lien. I showed them the bank statement that recorded the loan payoff. I showed them the forensic report that compared my known signatures with the POA. I let them look at the notary log and the IP metadata that placed the upload on Evan's device. Helen's face turned a color I'd seen 100 times, an embarrassed flush that slid fast into denial. "There must be a mistake," she said, "because that's what you say when the world asks you to stop protecting your child." Robert opened his mouth for a rationalization and closed it like the thing inside had outstayed its welcome. Evan started with the old script: confusion, then anger, then the promise that it was a misunderstanding. When Marcus asked the direct question, "Did you forge her signature?" there was a beat that broke everything. He sputtered excuses about paperwork mix-ups, about how he'd thought he had permission. And then, when those words didn't stick, the voice that had been allowed to skate clean for so long turned thin and sharp. He tried to make it small. He tried to make it plausible. I had prepared for that. Marcus slid a second document across the table. A confession of judgment and release of liability, drafted by him, precise and legally binding. It acknowledged the loan, acknowledged the forged signature, and accepted financial responsibility for the amount secured against the lake house. It offered Evan 2 choices: sign it now and accept civil consequences but avoid criminal referral, or refuse, in which case Marcus would file the forensic report with the county prosecutor and move immediately for criminal charges and an injunction to preserve evidence. Evan's mouth worked like an animal caught in a snare. For a long minute, he stared at the paper and then at me, and for a long minute, I watched his face register fear. The first honest emotion I'd ever seen from him when the consequences were his, not someone else's. Helen began to cry in the way people cry when their narratives are threatened. Loud, theatrical, as if noise could mend truth. He signed. It wasn't dramatized. There was no triumphant mic drop. He scribbled his name on the line with a pen that left ugly, hurried strokes. Marcus notarized the confession. I placed copies into the hands of the title company and the bank. I told them flatly that the house would be placed on the market by Friday and that proceeds would first clear the $100,000 lien and any associated costs. The rest, I said, would be handled through normal channels. I watched him sign away the insurance he'd never had to buy. The assumption of innocence by association. I watched his entitlement deflate into the small, legal weight of liability. The look on Helen's face was not repentance. It was recognition that the story wouldn't be easily rewritten to dress him as victim again. After the papers were signed and the title company confirmed the lien release steps, I did the last practical thing. I walked out of that kitchen and in doing so, closed the door on them. I cut off contact. I uninstalled the app that showed my family's group texts. I blocked numbers. It felt like slamming a heavy book shut on a chapter I'd been rereading for decades. They called. They left voicemails. They posted defenses cloaked as hurt on social media. Evan posted an apology that read like an exercise in performative humility rather than responsibility. I let it all live in their sphere. I did not step back in. Selling the lake house was ugly in ways I hadn't anticipated. The title searches, the realtor photos that reduced our summers to glossy angles, the final paperwork that moved ownership and memory into strangers' names. But it cleared the lien. It repaid the fraudulent loan. It untied the tidy little knot of my money becoming someone else's safety net. When the final check cleared and the lake house keys left my hands, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. A kind of relieved grief, a practical sorrow that traded nostalgia for freedom. I gained the clean air of consequence. Evan gained the legal truth, and with it a scar I hoped would be instructive. My parents gained the knowledge that the safety they'd long enjoyed on someone else's account had been exposed. The last thing I said, quiet, steady, wasn't a gloat. It was a sentence that had cost me years of politeness. I will not be complicit in this economy you call family anymore. Then I turned and walked away. Six months later, the sharp, ongoing hum of family drama has been replaced by smaller, steadier sounds. My kettle boiling at 7, the beep of my laundry finishing, the neighborhood dog that insists on practicing his bark outside my window every afternoon. Those ordinary noises used to feel like background static in a life that was mostly other people's emergencies. Now they sound like the soundtrack to a life I'm building. There were immediate, practical benefits I hadn't let myself imagine when I was still ledgering every kindness. The $67,000 I'd moved into my own account kept me from being one more unpaid promise. The lake house sale cleared the fraudulent lien and made sure the money that had once become their safety net stopped being my invisible mortgage. I paid off a small heap of lingering debts, booked a trip that had nothing to do with anyone else's timeline, and bought a couch that doesn't have a shadowed history attached to it. These were not dramatic gestures. They were the quiet reallocation of my life toward myself. The emotional work has been pricier than the checks I wrote. I paid for therapy like tuition, an expensive, necessary education in the soft architecture of self. My therapist, Lena, taught me to map my boundaries like blueprints, where they start, where they end, and which rooms are mine to furnish. I learned to recognize the old hunger that used to make me rescue people who could stand on their own if they simply remembered how. I learned to sit with the small, stubborn discomfort that comes when you decline a request and nobody collapses. That discomfort used to be a rumor of catastrophe. Now it's a fact. The world keeps spinning. Friends have been my scaffolding. They showed up with casseroles and spreadsheets, with quiet dinners and bigger conversations that didn't descend into blame. There was grief. There still is grief. But it's the honest kind. The sad recognition that people you loved didn't love you back the way you needed. There's also an odd, luminous relief in that recognition, like finally turning on a light in a room you didn't know you'd been walking into blind for years. The family texts continued, of course. Half apologies wrapped in, "I miss you," and whole paragraphs of rationalization. I read a few, answered none. Silence is a boundary too, and sometimes the most assertive thing you can do is refuse to be the stage for someone else's performance. The legal agreement stayed signed. The sale closed. The confession of judgment sits in a file that smells faintly of office paper and finality. Evan shows up in the occasional holiday photo on social media with a face that used to be untouched by consequence. Sometimes I think of him and feel only the same boredom I feel when watching a bad movie, predictable and now easy to skip. People ask if I regret it. Regret is a complicated shape. I regret that the lessons I learned cost me so much. Those were expensive tuitions, both emotional and financial. I regret the summers we won't have at the lake house. But I don't regret the education. I finally valued myself enough to stop underwriting other people's comfort at the cost of my own. There's a soft power in that decision. I used to define myself by how much I could protect others from inconvenience. Now I define myself by how I protect my own life from being reduced to someone else's default. That shift isn't glamorous. It's not a single triumphant scene. It's 100 small checkpoints. The refusal to answer, the new direct deposit, the appointment on my calendar that's only for me. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at the plainness of it. I am no longer the architect of their comfort. I am the architect of my own peace.